My next guest is John Santos, a West Coast percussionist, very well known for all his work with Tito Puente, Dizzy Gillespie, and many others, Cachao, a lot of the Cuban artists over the years who traditionally and recent, he's very involved in the whole West Coast scene in San Francisco, the Bay Area. And please remember to subscribe and like to receive further notices on our upcoming podcasts. Mr. John Santos. All right. Thank you, John. This is so nice of you to join me. You're out in San Francisco. I know you've had a very long, I shouldn't say history, and I've known you for a long time, and you're one of the people that always comes to mind as that guy who knows everything about not just the Cuban, but all that world that I personally love. I mean, I'm a percussionist and all of that, but that world, that music world that just, I would say the world. You're a specialist in this. Thanks for joining me, John.
Thank you, Aldo. It's my pleasure. You know, first of all, I'm in Oakland, actually. I was born and raised in San Francisco, but I moved to Oakland in 1991. I've been here ever since then. Wow, I don't know how I possibly got a reputation that I know everything about anything, because I feel like a jack of all trades, but master of none. I'm an eternal student, and as you are, I know, and that's really where I'm coming from.
And before we start on this, talking about the shaping your journey, which is I'm always fascinated with this and how each one of us has shaped our journey, because we're really in charge. So what are those decisions that happen, that we take, people who open doors for us? But before we get on that, John, tell us a little bit about, like, what was that first thing, the spark that started it for you? What was that fire that started the fire for you?
Well, for me, it's easy. It's my family, because I grew up in a very musical family. My mother's side is Puerto Rican, and my father's side from Cape Verde. And my grandfathers in both of those traditions were professional musicians. So the first band that I ever played with was with my Puerto Rican grandfather, and I was with those elders. I was probably 11 years old. And I had some musical experience before, because I played clarinet from the 3rd grade to the 5th grade for about 3 years. I was in a marching band, and I learned what little I know about reading music and theory from that experience. And but being around those elders in my grandfather's band really was exciting for me, and for them. You know, they're always looking for a young person who wants to learn about the traditions, and they took me under their wing, and they taught me, and they brought me material and recordings, and they really guided me from the beginning.
Well, so you didn't go to school, you didn't have a degree like the typical trajectory that many of us go through.
That's correct. I have no formal musical training. I was lucky to be around a very musical scene in San Francisco, where I grew up. San Francisco, of course, was a hotbed for all kinds of music. We had an incredible rock and roll scene here in the 60s, Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, and they lived here. And the blues and jazz, very big. And then the traditional music in my family, very deep-rooted. My older brothers and cousins also, I came from a big family, and they, whatever music was hip for them, the ones that were 5, 6, 7 years older than the younger ones, we would adapt. So because of that, we really came to appreciate everything from Jimi Hendrix to the Beatles to the Rolling Stones to Motown and soul and funk and James Brown, and the whole thing was there in addition to the traditional music from Puerto Rico and Cuba. And I mean, when I say Cuba, I say that because my grandfather's band was made up of Puerto Rican musicians, but I would say at least a third, if not more, of the repertoire was Cuban. They used to play rumbas and sones and Cuban boleros, as well as bomba plena, música jíbara, and Latin boleros from all over Latin America. So it was a very wide range of music, but nothing formal. I didn't. That's one kind of regret that I have, is that I didn't have the patience to really learn theory and go to school. And I had the opportunity to work with a lot of giants in the music, including Cachao and Tito Puente and Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, and I opted to do that instead of going to school, and that's where I'm at.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you're talking about people like Cachao, for anyone who's listening, Cachao was a bass player, Cuban bass player, who immigrated to the States, but he was a force way back in the 50s, I believe, John, right? When he moved
the 40s, actually.
The 40s.
Yeah.
But did he move to the States in the 40s?
No. He came to the States, but he was influencing the music in the States in the 40s. But he didn't move here until after the revolution, like 61 or so.
Right. Yes. I have these long conversations with Walfredo Reyes Sr. Of course, he's like that bridge and on both sides, which is amazing. And it's always interesting to see who was influencing who and how in that whole development, which was super interesting. As you know, I spent a lot of time in Cuba and they do these trips and all this exploration. And I'm always interested in learning more, and I'm always uncovering something. And I have a few friends who always send me things that I had no idea where they come from, like all those descargas they used to record back in the day in Havana. Even David Amram, when he went to Cuba on that famous cruise with Dizzy, and then Ry Cooder was there, and then that led to the Buena Vista Social Club. Everything is like a coincidence, but not a coincidence. Like something, the forces decide this has to happen. Interesting. But I'm really curious. Your great interest in Cuban music, because for some reason I've known your work and I've seen you perform with Omar Sosa and a few other people, but your complete knowledge of the Cuban tradition is a lot deeper than most people, because some people go to the surface, but I've noticed that you really go deep. So you must have spent time with people down there. You must have.
Well, I spent some time down there, but most of what I have learned about Cuban music was not learned in Cuba, but it was learned from Cubans and from materials, being outside of Cuba. I've been to Cuba 4 times only in my life. I went for the first time in 1990. I took a 2-week dance course called Folk Cuba with the Folclórico Nacional, the national folklore troupe. That was a mind-blowing trip for me, because I was there for a month, and 2 weeks was this dance class. And the dance class was amazing, because when you learn, whether you're learning song or to dance, song, rumba, Congo, Yoruba, danzón, whatever it is, there's a live orchestra, a live band playing for you. They're not playing to recordings.
Right.
So that was really a beautiful thing for me. And I met so many mentors and some people who became like family for me. I met on that trip the people from Clave Huahuanco, Amado and Lali and Alejandro, and they really opened the doors for me there in Havana. I became very close with them. And also Ernesto Oviedo, I became close to the Oviedo family, the offspring of the great Tresero Isaac Oviedo. And I was able to meet Isaac before he died. He was about 90 years old. I got to meet him, and it's a little bit of a long story how all that went down, but just to say that I met a lot of wonderful people, and Ernesto Oviedo, the oldest son of Isaac, became like my Cuban daddy. And when he saw how much I love traditional Cuban music, he asked me, who would you like to meet? And I would name all of these elders. He was surprised I even knew their names, but he would say, oh no, that person already died. That person lives around the corner. That person lives in this barrio, and I'll take you. He took me to the different houses of these elders to interview them and to meet them. And so that was my introduction to Cuba.
Wow.
And then I went a few times subsequently. I went in 97. I took my group, the Machete Ensemble, to play in the Jazz Festival in 97. I went again in 2002, kind of a honeymoon almost with my wife. And then I went again in 2018. I went to the festival in Santiago de Cuba, my first and only time there. And that was a beautiful experience. But I had some Cubans here in the Bay Area. We had the honor of having Armando Peraza as a resident here forever. He was here since the 50s. Also Francisco Aguabella. And those were like those are my padrinos in the tambor, in the drumming. They were amazing gentlemen. I got to spend a lot of time with them. I got to record with them and play with them and hang out with them and take them to breakfast and have stories, and just a great relationship with those elders. And then one more I would mention is the great Orestes Vilato, who, of course, is one of the pioneers of the timbal in particular, pioneer of salsa in New York City. He moved to San Francisco in 1980 to play with Santana, and he played with Santana throughout the decade of the 80s. But when he was not on the road, he would be playing and recording with me. And when he left Santana in 89, he became a permanent member of my group, and he's been living here ever since. And of course, Walfredo, as you mentioned, has been living here for decades. So having those elders here to share stories, to ask questions, to play, to record, has been an immense education for me.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, that's almost like being in Cuba, because those are the guys. Those are the real people. And I know most of them, of course, and I mean that's almost everybody. You didn't have Changuito, but or Piloto or those guys, but still, from the tradition point of view, that's amazing. And
I was lucky though to meet Changuito, and Changuito came here, and he sat in. He played with my band, with the Machete Ensemble. He gave me one of my few formal conga drum lessons. I've had 2 conga drum lessons in my life. One when I was 11. And one from Changuito, and was, of course, mind-blowing.
Yeah. Well, the Changuito tends to do that. I had a drum set lesson with Changuito because we had brought him to the States, to Cosa, and way back in the beginning of Cosa, and this was a really big deal. And it was in the days where everything was impossible. So we had to to get to him first, we had to find him in Havana. And of course, there are no real addresses, so we're trying to find him. My wife was pregnant, and this was August, right? Like 40 degrees Celsius, and we're trying to find him. And I'm in the cab, and I'm looking at the address, and I'm looking at my wife. I think it's this. So I'm giving the guy the address, and he says, well, I'm not sure. I think it's on this and that. And then I said to my wife, I said, I'm sure Changuito gave us the right address. The guy looked up, he says, oh, you're looking for Changuito. So then he just sped up and took us to his house. Everybody, you know how that works. Yeah. And that was amazing. So we climbed up to, at the time he was living in this apartment on a 3rd floor or something. But we had to bring him to the States, and that one year was normally we did Cosa in Vermont, but that one year we did it in Potsdam, which was very close to the Canadian border. So we said the easiest way to do this is to bring him to Canada and then the States, and then just drive him over, which was very close. But then we had to have 2 visas, and it became a big deal. So I asked the help of Bill Martinez, who you probably know
very well.
There. And I said, you got to help me with this one, because, now I know everyone in Cuba, the whole, the Ministry of Culture, all the ambassadors, and everybody open doors. Whatever you need, Aldo, we love what you do, and thank you for doing this. But back then it was a different story, so it was long and laborious. But then we got Changuito to stay for a month. So then, we got Berkeley in on it. We got him to go out west afterwards, after he finished with us. So he spent a lot of time. This is 95 or 6.
Yeah.
I think 6, 7, something like that. So I said, if he's going to come here, let's...
Game.
Huh?
as you know, he changed the game. For drum set players, for timbal players, for conga drummers, and he held court wherever he went. I had the honor of also being on the faculty at Berkeley, at the Berkeley School of Music for the summer program a few times, and Walfredo and Changuito and Oretes and many others were there, Giovanni, at the same time.
Wow, yeah.
And man, after the teaching during the day, we'd be hanging out in the hotel room, and Changuito would just hold court. Even with all those masters there, he would hold court, and everybody became a elementary school teacher. I mean, a student.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because, he helped me a lot with my book when I decided to write this book, Cuban Rhythms for Percussion and Drum Set. And I made sure that he filtered everything. I said, please look at this. Am I saying the right thing? I didn't invent anything, but the methodology is very important. And so he did. So once it was finished, he looked at me, he says, okay, that's a good start, but you have to come back and there's so much more to say and do. So you'll have to come back. And we never really got to it because he's gotten really ill recently. But anyway, there's so much, and he would do that. He would just give, as you say, a whole court. That's a really good word. But he was the ultimate teacher. And he was like a fountain. He is a fountain of knowledge. And often I would look sideways and wonder, he's not a trained musician. Where in God's name does all this information come from? And it's incredible. It's incredible. And he really knows, like the tradition. It's like he goes like really deep. And if you're paying attention, you learn a lot, of course. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
So we've been fortunate with that one.
Mm-hmm.
You've worked with other people. I mean, Los Muñequitos also down there on tour.
Los Muñequitos, I got to meet them on my first trip to Cuba, and when they came here, I was always around. I emceed a show that they played at, and I got to meet them and hang out with them. I went to parties where they were, so we got to play rumba together, and so of course a great learning experience. But I never really. Well, actually, another time where I had a great experience with them, I taught one semester at the university at Madison, Wisconsin, back around 2002. And I had a part of the program was a wonderful program where I got to work in the community and work with the percussionists in the university, as well as I curated a concert series at a blues club in town called Luther's. And part of it was they allowed me to, during the course of the semester, bring in groups to play. So I would do these like lecture on Cuban music, one aspect of Cuban music. I would talk about rumba, and I was able to bring the Muñequitos from Cuba to Madison. I brought John Benitez's group from New York. I brought Omar Sosa. My group Machete Ensemble played. Giovanni Hidalgo I brought with a group. And so, they just said, who do you want to bring? And I named these people, and boom, it happened. So Beautiful. I got to spend time with them because of that. But before I ever met them, of course, they're the masters. Those recordings, I was exposed to them in the 60s, and those recordings to this day, they're classic, and they're such beautiful learning tools to just go back at any time and listen to every aspect, the voices, the drumming, the quinto, the phrasing. I mean, they're just masters from the beginning up to now. And we just had the pleasure of having a few of them here recently, a couple of weeks ago, a great project of Susana Arenas, who's a Cuban woman who has an Afro-Cuban troupe here, company, and then Bongo Sibide, who's a Guinean musician who plays djembe. He has his own troupe, and they did a collaboration that was out of this world, and they brought three of these muñequitos. They brought Barbarito, who lives in Miami now, the dancer, and his son, Yus Clavis, and a couple others. I think there were two others, I forgot the names, and they were fabulous. And they combine with some local musicians who are recent arrivals here also from Cuba, Andy Perez, Einar Leliebre Núñez from Santiago, and they're great rumberos and bataleros. It was really an incredible show, and thos matanceros was super present in that.
Nice, nice. That's so beautiful, and to experience that. I remember when Jesus, the father, was still around, and we would do classes when we in Matanzas with them at their studio. Now the son, of course, took over, and I mean they're still amazing. Them, Afro Cuba. Um, I mean there are so many great people. There's another group that I really enjoy in the near Moron. I can't remember. Camagüey. Camagüey. Yeah, there's a fabulous group in Camagüey that are as forward thinking as Muñequitos because there's
Rumbata,
one thing. Sorry.
rumbata.
Yes, that's it. Rumbata. Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing, amazing. But the
Yes.
nice thing about all of this, and because some people get stuck with the idea that, these people, as great as they are, they play the traditional music and it freezes there. Not true. I mean, just like the Africans, just any artist who has gone deep in their own tradition always is exploring the new ideas, new ways of incorporating and moving forward with this. So it's fascinating, and I'm sure you've seen it, John. These
Most
guys are
certainly.
like they don't stop. They're not frozen in time.
No, not at all. No, and improvisation, innovation. I mean, that's part of the tradition. It's not like the tradition is one thing and the innovation is separate. It's part of the tradition. You have to be able to know, have your mind open, and be able to improvise and innovate. That's always been part of the tradition.
Yeah, no, very well said. Very well said. And you can't, in my opinion, your improvisations or your innovations are less meaningful if you don't have that tradition. Then it has meaning, it has direction, and it has purpose. My opinion, and I'll stand by that, Your Honor.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah, you've had the chance to also work with people like Eddie Palmieri, Dizzy Gillespie, also. I mean, all these great people in your trajectory, working with all of these people all along, right, along your way.
Yeah, very fortunate, to just be in the right place at the right time and meet folks who open doors. My first trip to New York was in 1978, and I met René Lopez.
Okay.
And René is such an important figure in my life and my career. He is just, his interest, his deep knowledge about the traditional Puerto Rican and Cuban music, and how they relate to each other, and how they relate to colonial history, how they fit into our whole evolution in the Americas. His perspective is so profound. I had never heard anything like that, before or after, to tell you the truth. He's so deep. So he became like a guru for me. I brought him out here the same year. I brought him to the Bay Area to do some lectures, and we've had a close relationship ever since then. And that really inspired me to dig deep into the history of the music, into the folklore, the history, listening to the early recordings from the 20s and even earlier than that, and understanding the importance, the connection to jazz, the connection with the evolution of jazz in New York and in New Orleans and here. And it's such a web, such a puzzle. He really gave me a lot of clues. But because I became close with him, he opened a lot of doors for me, because he's highly respected by every generation in New York City. So through him, I got to also become close with the next generation, like the Fort Apache guys, Jerry and Andy, Milton Cardona, Steve Berrios, and that crew. I became very
Yes.
close with all of those guys too, and they play a big role in my career as well.
Yeah, and John Amira is out there. He's another source of information. I mean, he's done a lot of research himself, right?
Yeah, I don't know John well. I've met him. I have his book, his Bata book, which was one of the very first ones coming out about transcribing the Bata rhythms. And he, yeah, definitely a force, a positive force, is going back to probably the 60s in his case, also, at least the 70s for sure. But I don't know John too well. I don't have any interactions, with him or experience with him other than speaking to him once or twice on the phone or communicating with email. I certainly have a lot of respect for his work.
Yeah, no, he's done a lot. We had him out at COSA, and I remember he had done a lot of research in that, and I really enjoy when people have done their research, and then whatever you happen to do with it, at least it comes from a place of history and meaningfulness. Because sometimes we just invent things or we assume, and it's not true. It's the same thing when, sometimes I hear people who refer to Cuban music as all Afro-Cuban. And, and no, it's not all Afro-Cuban. Some of it is Afro-Cuban, the ternary, and some of it is son, which is definitely not Cuban, And so there's a big difference. And I really enjoy having, especially when we do these trips to Cuba, have a musicologist explain like the different areas that the Cuban music comes from, because Cuba is a musical continent. And then we have Puerto Rico like across the street practically. So the connection there is very strong. It's not another world. It's like next door. You can almost walk to it. And then you have Haiti, that has its history, which is quite different from Matanzas and Havana. And, after their revolution, what they brought to Santiago, which is totally different from the rest of the country, which is fascinating, and the connection between Santiago and Brazil, the music, where did that come from? And, all its variations, the conga francesa, all of those things, which is really fascinating. And I don't think we've seen the beginning or the tip of that iceberg, musically speaking. And that would take a couple of lifetimes in my book. Maybe not for you, but for me.
No, for anybody.
Yeah. And the people like Tito Puente, you worked with him as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tito, another one who, long before I ever met him, we were trying to imitate his solos and listening to all the beautiful recordings going back to the 40s, the late 40s when he started recording, and into the 50s and 60s, and all of his recordings are classic, beautiful. I got to know Tito because in the 80s, Tito was a santero. He was a hijo de Obatala. And his padrino was an older Cuban gentleman by the name of Nilo Tandron. And Nilo lived here in the Mission District, in the Latino district where I grew up. And Nilo, at one point, a good friend of mine who was the flautist in a group I directed in the early 80s, his name is Juan Ceballos. He called me one day. He said, "Hey, man, I live in this place, and one of my roommates is Nilo Tandron, the padrino of Tito Puente." And so Tito at that time had signed with Concord Records, which is a local Bay Area record company. So he was coming out here a lot to record and to play. And every time he came here, he spent most of his time when he was not in the studio at Nilo's house, at his padrino's house. So Juan told me, whenever Tito was around, he said, "Yeah, come down, Tito's coming." And so we got to hang out. And man, that was amazing because Tito is an amazing storyteller and historian and walking encyclopedia of the history of Cuban and Puerto Rican music in New York. But Nilo was from Cuba, older than Tito, and he grew up in the 20s and 30s and 40s. He knew all of that music. He knew the words. So like a lot of times we had these old 78s and old songs and you couldn't hear the lyrics. He knew the words to all the songs. And
nice.
So we got to hang out and spend a lot of time. I became close with Tito. And at that time in the mid 80s, I had the opportunity. Tito invited me to play. So I recorded on 3 of Tito's records in the mid 80s.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah,
And
and
he
he's
played with my group as well. He sat in. You know, he was a great gentleman.
yeah. I had the opportunity once. I met him. That was in with Repercussion, my group. I think we were in San Antonio or somewhere playing some festival, and we performed, and then we went to see him perform, and then I went to see him backstage, and I actually asked him. I said, "Would you do something with us at some point?" And he said, "Absolutely." He was such an open person, and just like that, he says, "Yeah, just call me. Here's my number." And of
Yeah.
course, we were all so busy, and he was so busy, that never worked out. But he was such a giving person for someone who was so prolific musically and so active. Amazing.
Yeah, I love Tito. I mean, Tito, they broke the mold with Tito. You know, really, Tito's unique because he was such a street guy. You know, he was from the street, he was from the hood, he was from the barrio, and that's why everybody related to him. You know, he really knew that he came from the streets, but he went to Juilliard and he graduated and he was an arranger and he played vibes and
Yes.
saxophone and drum set, and he was really a genius. And of course, he revolutionized the instrument, the timbal. He's the most influential player in the history of that instrument, really. Changuito changed things, many years later, but Tito really was the king.
Yeah, yeah. And to this day, I mean, he might as well be alive.
Yeah.
you know, it's amazing what he's done with all those recordings. It's like he must have done like 150 recordings. Tito.
Oh gosh, at least.
Amazing in those days. And the funny thing is, like, he was like, to me, the kind of the gentleman force that brought the Cuban thing and the Puerto Rican thing together. And in New York, I mean, the whole salsa development that happened in New York. He was, apart from whatever anyone was doing around. I mean, that's my. I remember studying with people down Frankie Malaby and all those guys in New York, but he was also Tito Puente was like the Switzerland of all of that, and he just neutralized every kind of thought or every kind of music, because this is music and this is the way it's done. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tito was Puerto Rican, a New Yorican, but I think it needs to be clarified that Tito was very adamant that the music he played was Afro-Cuban. He was not playing Puerto Rican music. He was playing Cuban music. At the time when he was coming up, it was Afro-Cuban. The Afro-Puerto Rican part was very small in New York City compared to the mambo and the cha-cha-cha and the Cuban, the 6/8 stuff, the bembe, all that stuff that Tito incorporated. And then, of course, Tito was a jazz player too. Tito was a jazz fan and grew up in the mecca of jazz in New York. So, it wasn't, at that time, it was not called Latin jazz. It was called Afro-Cuban jazz. And Tito was
Okay.
very clear about that. Now, it's the Puerto Rican community that supported that music and that went to dance and, of course, brought their element as well. And, there was a Puerto Rican element there. But, Tito's music, the big band stuff that he did, the conjunto stuff that he did, the tunes that he chose to play, it was by and large Cuban, much more so influenced by Cuban music. Now, as time went on, that altered. He incorporated, little by little more Puerto Rican music. He recorded a couple of bombas. I don't know if he ever recorded a plena. He may not have, but the Puerto Rican roots were important. The Puerto Rican community is the one that really preserved the traditional Cuban music in New York, especially in 1960 when the stuff hit the fan and the revolution happened, and there were no longer Cuban groups coming to New York. It was the Puerto Rican community that held on to the traditions of Cuban music, and those became the groundwork for the salsa that came up. And then the salsa incorporated more Puerto Rican and other elements as well. But in Tito's time, pre-revolution, it was really mainly Cuban influence in his music.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I remember Tito. There's a story where when he recorded those famous albums of only percussion, What were some of those albums called with the record company said you're
one
crazy?
was called Puente in Percussion. Another one is called Top Percussion.
Top Percussion, that's right. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
he made a few, and those are all Cuban, completely 100% Afro-Cuban.
And they were big hits back then. And the record company says, "This? Are you kidding?" And he was very visionary, and they were huge, apparently, right?
They're huge and they're beautiful. They're so well recorded. Again, those were recorded in 1957, around that time, 56, 57. And man, you can go back right now and listen to that stuff and it holds up. It's not dated. It sounds gorgeous. It features Patato, Mongo, Willy Bobo, Aguabella, Julito Collazo, and those guys played their behinds off on those recordings. I mean, if for any student, you have to, that has to be part of your training. As any student in those instruments, you have to know that style and transcribe some of those. Just like a jazz player, you're going to transcribe some Bird and some Train. You got to transcribe some of those solos because they're classic.
Yeah, yeah. And when it suddenly dawned on me, well, it was somebody I forget who mentioned it to me, those recordings, and I went out and bought, and I think I still have the Top Percussion one. I couldn't believe the story behind it and the recordings. Back then, the recordings weren't that great, but this one was. I mean, they spent a lot of production time on these to sound amazing, and of course, the playing was.
They're recorded well. But I mean, when you say production time, that's deceptive too, because nowadays production time could mean many, many, many hours of post-production. That's not what they did back then. It just means that they had good studio and a good engineer who knew how to record it, because there's no overdubs. They play it and boom, it's what it is. And they didn't mic every single instrument, where you mic every instrument has one or two or three mics and then you have to mix it down later. No, they record the big band with a few mics. The vocalists have a mic and boom. It's very simple compared to the way it's done now. And man, it's hard to recreate that. Even now with all the technology, it's very difficult to get that kind of a beautiful sound that they got in the simplistic times.
Yeah. Well, the pressure was on. I mean, it's this moment that you're recording, and that makes a big difference when you can't punch in and out or redo a take.
Right.
That's amazing. There's another vibes player from the West Coast that comes to mind. I wonder, Cal Jader. Did you do any work with him, or did you know of him? And what was any relationship?
Cal Jader for us was really, really influential, because he was from here. He went to school here in San Francisco, in college, and from the beginning, his first group was formed here in San Francisco, and I knew a couple of guys who were in his first group. In 1954, he formed his group, and among the members of his group, he had the great Benny Velarde, was a Panamanian percussionist, and Benny went to high school with my father. So we were close with Benny. Benny was kind of like an uncle for me. He also had a radio show here back in the 60s. And very, very important gentleman in San Francisco, salsa and Latin jazz. He was in the band. Also, the brothers Manny and Carlos Duran, who are Mexicans from this area. They were the bass player. Manny was the piano player and Carlos was the bass player in that group. And also Edgar Rosales, who was also a singer and percussionist in the band. His nephew is Leo Rosales, who was a founding member of the group Malo, the great Latin rock group Malo. So that, we were very connected. That group was very connected to the community here and was very popular. My father and my uncles had a lot of Cal Jader records. And of course, Armando Peraza recorded extensively with him, as well as Mongo and Willy Bobo. Mongo and Willy left Tito Puente's band in New York City, left that band to come west to join Cal Jader's band. and that was still in the 50s, toward the late 50s. They made some absolutely amazing recordings. So we grew up listening to, from the beginning, listening to those Cal Tjader records, playing along with the records, and very, very important. I got to meet him when my group in the early 80s opened for Cal at a festival on the campus in Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. And Cal saw my guido, and he asked me if he wanted to use my guido. So I said, of course, and he used my guido, and we became friends. I got to meet him, and many years later, let me think about that. That was the early 80s. No, I had actually met him before that, because when Poncho Sanchez joined that band in 1975.
So Pancho played with Cal?
Poncho played with Cal that's how Poncho made his name. In 1975, when Cal needed a conga drummer, and they were in San Francisco playing at the Great American Music Hall, and the drummer was another great friend of mine, a very influential drummer by the name of Vince Lateano, was the drummer in Cal's band. And Vince knew Poncho and recommended Poncho, and Poncho came up in 75, and Vince called me to say, hey, I want you to meet this guy, Poncho Sanchez. He's going to play with Cal. So we hung out, and I started a close relationship with Poncho, which I still enjoy today. And I went to the Great American Music Hall that night and heard Poncho, when he had just started with Cal, and they invited me to sit in. And so I had a chance to sit in with Cal's band on conga on that occasion in 1975. So I've had a few occasions up until the time, of course, when Cal passed. I think I don't remember the date when he passed. He was on the road in the Philippines when he passed, but a big influence, Cal, for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of it's funny because that whole movement out there, and he was being a vibes player. I mean, and then you have Tito Puente on the East Coast, the vibes player. And I'm making this parallel here a little bit, but it's interesting, like how much people like Carlos Santana might have been influenced by somebody like Cal Tjader. Just curious.
Yeah, for sure, because being here, because Carlos Santana is also grew up in the Mission District here, in the same place where I grew up, and so he went to high school at the same high school where my father went. He went to high school with my older brothers and my older cousins, and so all of them were heavily influenced by the scene here in San Francisco. And right. Cal was the ultimate. Cal was the #1 Latin jazz group, and really one of the very top jazz groups, period, who used to play a lot at the jazz clubs. They would play at the Matador, at the Hungry Eye. There were different clubs here that they played at, jazz clubs, straight ahead jazz clubs. The Jazz Workshop was another one. So Carlos was in that scene, and when Carlos started playing around, the North Beach scene was the jazz neighborhood. There were several clubs, and he interacted with different people who came in and out of Cal's band, including Armando Peraza, including Luis Gasca and Victor Pantoja, who also recorded with Cal. And they played with Carlos, they played with Cal, and there definitely was a lot of interaction going on.
Interesting, yeah. No, and of course, I mean, that area is not a huge area. I mean, it was like a neighborhood in this city, practically, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. I remember growing up and looking over at San Francisco, like the Haight-Ashbury era and all of that, and we were saying, wow, what's going on over there? And so much coming out of that place. It was oozing. The only word I can think of is oozing. Music and creativity, more than any other place that I can think of. Being that small also, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of great music here, and the jazz side and the Cuban side. Also, San Francisco was a destination. So all the major groups from the East Coast, when they tour, if they're touring bands, they're going to come through San Francisco. Right. So everybody came through here. All the greatest jazz players came through here, and the same with the Latin players, with the Machito Orchestra, Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, Arsenio. Those groups played in San Francisco.
Right, yeah. And then, of course, you have people like Tower of Power that's from out there also. They have Garibaldi and I learned just recently that Mike Clark. I grew up in San Francisco.
That's right.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like Italians. They're everywhere. But San Francisco was one of those fusion cities that, I mean, everything from Jimi Hendrix to all those people and the jazz and everything in between, pop. I mean, Janis Joplin. I mean, is an incredible environment for creativity. It's amazing, and I think, I mean, that kind of thing probably happened everywhere to a lesser or greater extent, but San Francisco was definitely one of those places that just blew up, and it was so close that I'm sure everybody was just waving at each other all the time on the way to do some concert or some rehearsal.
Yeah, it's a small community, small, definitely not spread out like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Philadelphia. It is a relatively small area, so that's been a blessing, in its own way.
Yeah, and people like Rebecca, who is out there, still active, right? She's been on the scene for forever, as far as I remember.
Yeah,
Rebecca
sure.
Maleon, yeah, great
Yeah,
pianist.
Rebecca started actually, she was 14 years old when she joined my group. And
Hey,
I brought her into the folklore group I had at the time. And then the group Batachanga was the first, the group before that in the 70s, we had a group, a charanga. The first charanga was called Típica Cienfuegos. The second one was Batachanga, and she was a member of that group. And she was always very talented as a teenager, very, very gifted. She's been working now the last 15 years as the director of the education department of the San Francisco Jazz, of SF
beautiful.
Jazz. So she's definitely a big part of the scene here.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
recorded a lot with me with the Machete Ensemble. Machete Ensemble, that group that I directed from 1985 to 2006, 21 years, she was there for the first half of it. And then she went off and kind of made her own solo career about like in the mid 90s.
Right. And you have people like Michael Spiro, who's out there, great percussionist.
Yeah, Michael came here around 1980 and quickly, got into the scene here and was a great student of Cuban music and went to Cuba many, many times and has studied. And now he's one of the main teachers.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, so there are all of these people out there, so it's amazing. But you know what I specifically enjoy, and when you speak to Rebecca, tell her I really, this whole thing that San Francisco Jazz Festival has understood the value and the importance of continuation, meaning education, education of history, education of what's coming, and just guiding people in understanding what's going on and what's been going on and contextualize. I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think every jazz festival should have that element.
Yeah. The founder of the SF Jazz Festival was Randall Klein. And Randall, was open to a lot of that stuff. I was very lucky to work a lot with him. I worked, actually, the group that I directed, that Rebecca was part of, back in the early 80s, we played at the very first San Francisco Jazz Festival in 1983, the group Batachanga. We played then. And ever since then, I had a close relationship with Randall and with the festival and worked for the festival in various capacities as an advisor and as a trustee and played it many times. And he allowed me to do projects. He'd say, what do you want to do? Who do you want to bring? And who would you like to collaborate with? I said, Joe Henderson. And so he would call Joe Henderson, and Joe Henderson played as a guest with our group for the festival. And then I produced a show for him in 1989 called La Evolución de la Música Afro-Cubana. It was at Davies Symphony Hall, and at 3,000 seat hall. And we packed the hall. It was my group, the Machete Ensemble, and my folklore group, Quindembo, with special guests, Cachao, Chocolate Armenteros, Santana, Armando Peraza, Walfredo de los Reyes, Orestes, all these folks that I would suggest, and they got them. They would hire them. So we were able through the festival to really expand the programming, to really be sure that it included this Latino root and the world music root, element in the programming. And to this day, they still do that. And Rebecca has been there for 15 years in the education department. And so they're bringing the music into the schools and expanding into the community. Very, very beautiful program. After 40 years, though, the director, Randall, is no longer there, and they're going through some changes. They have a new leadership, and hopefully it continues in the same upward direction.
Yeah. Now, hopefully they understand the value of that. And I remember reading about all those lectures you used to do, and I thought that's brilliant, and that's so important, contextualizing. I was invited a couple of times to different festivals to contextualize who the artist was, and I always thought that's so important. Yes, you see the performance, and a lot of people appreciate it, but being able to be one-on-one with the actual artist, or someone who knew the artist well enough to be the conduit and explain the context of where things are coming from, and facilitate the conversation of what's going on past and what's we're looking to future, and it's really development. Now we have that opportunity, and maybe back in the 50s and 60s it was not so. So we all had to learn, like just going to concerts, watching, listening, or if you're in the band, then you have the conversation. But now people, we have the opportunity, and I think we should take it. I'm just saying, patting you guys in the back, because I think the San Francisco Jazz Festival is just doing a wonderful thing, and having you guys who are so knowledgeable, and you know what should be done. So somebody who's smart from an administrative point of view would say, okay, John, what do we need? And that's easy, right? Because and people like you. People, we've been around the block. We can make comments, we can make statements that are based on a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom that is not always tapped into, but in your case, it is, and I'm a big fan of this. So this is fantastic.
Well, yeah, we're doing similar work to what you're doing back there. The aspect of education is so important, as you know. I don't know if you're aware of a group here called Oaktown Jazz.
No, I don't.
Probably not. Oaktown Jazz is another program. It's the oldest running jazz program for kids. It was started by a good friend of mine, Khalil Shahid, who was a trumpet player who passed away several years ago. But he started the program, and this past Saturday, we played at the 30th anniversary of that organization. And it was beautiful because they had the kids who are currently in it. My son, who is 16, has come through that program, and he played piano with us on one tune. And several alumni of that group over the past 30 years came from New York and LA, came up to play, including some of the players you might know who were in New York, like Casmendi George. He's a sax player, wonderful player who lives in New York. Jesse Levitt, who played for about 6 years in New York. You might know Ambrose Akinmusire, the trumpet player.
Yes.
Those are great. Some of the alumni of this program, Oaktown Jazz. So there's another one called Oakland Public Conservatory that Angela Wellman, trombone player, directs. So that aspect of education in jazz is something that is going on here in the Bay Area, and there's a few organizations that are really celebrating it, that are doing great work for several decades now.
Nice. And this is like parallel to the schools that people register for, and it's a parallel program?
It's like a separate thing. It's like an after-school program, but they bring programs into the schools also. Beautiful. So they have teachers, they have classes, they do, the music teachers at the schools will send their kids to the after-school program, and they learn, add on to what they're learning, and then they go back to the schools with that program and play assemblies and offer, talk to the kids about what they're offering. And it's a beautiful, beautiful program. Thousands of kids have come through the program.
Nice. That's so nice to see. With the COSA thing, we've developed programs, in Cuba, in China, in Europe, and here, the States. And that has its mission, but my wish would have been to connect with more universities, more of these structures who we can work with and be channels to all of those places. That was kind of the original plan. Some of it worked, and you have some great players who have come to COSA over the years. We've had participants who have come to the COSA workshops maybe 20 times, 20 years in a row, and some only a few. But we've had great people coming through. Mark Juliana, for example, was a participant who went on. Well, we all know what happened to Mark, and many others. Just because you're in the environment of total intense with all the top people on the planet, as it should be, and in these programs in the schools, that's important. What's more important, even, they should start these programs, cultural programs, not just cultural, but performing arts. It could be even dance, or it could be any of the other performing arts. But in grade school, kindergarten, I mean, that's the creative, because now if people learn a language, it's universal, of course, but also the creativity and what happens to the individual when they're captivated by creativity, then great things happen. Not all the funny stuff that happens on the planet, sometimes because people are bored, or there's no creativity, so they have to do something. And that creative force then becomes negative rather than positive in the arts, in performing arts. I mean, this is I'm teaching to the choir here.
You remind me of something. There's a guy here. I don't know if you ever heard of C.K. Ladzekpo. You know who's C.K. Ladzekpo? You know the name Ladzekpo?
No.
Ladzekpo is a Ghanaian name from the Ewe tribe. And the Ewe, Ladzekpo is from the royal family of the Ewe. And several of them became musicians and teachers. One of the brothers taught in Boston, one taught in LA, and CK became a tenured professor at UC Berkeley starting in the 70s here. So he's still around. He's a master Ghanaian drummer, and he knows all about the folklore, the choreography, the dancing. His wife teaches dance, and he's the drummer. And he's an amazing, absolutely amazing drummer and teacher. But one of the many things that he said that stuck in my head is that he says that mental illness is not something that's common in his tradition in West Africa. And he said it's because of rhythm. He said that, Westerners, it's kind of a Western thing, mental illness, and then a whole industry about treating it, and pharmacies, treating the therapy and all of the thing. It's a very Western thing. And he said it's because of the lack of rhythm that Westerners have. And he goes on to give a demonstration that is absolutely amazing, where he says, when you're in your mama's stomach before you're born, you're getting rhythmically prepared for the world, and your mother is dancing up until the time that she gives birth. She's dancing, and so you're hearing the rhythms and you're feeling the movement. And the drummers have this thing that the dancers also do, which is they can play a rhythm or do a movement that is relaxed, that is soothing, that gives peace. And is something
the elk movements. But you can also, at will, the lead drummer can throw something on top of there that is chaotic and that's seemingly disparate and sounds like warfare and it's chaos, but it's totally controlled, and that the lead drummer throws that in order to cause the possession, to bring the presence of the divinity. They play these wild figures, and then they'll, at the right time, back it off. When they want to, they back it off. And the dancers have the same capacity to have one part of their body doing something very simple, and at the same time another part of their body doing something that is very polyrhythmic. And it's, to the Westerner, it's like, oh my God, that seems chaotic. And it's not. It's something that the Africans have from before you're born. And it teaches you how to deal with life. When something's thrown in your way, you don't fall down or try to go against it. You gracefully dance around it and you move around. And it's a beautiful analogy. And of course,
mental illness is not 100% that simple, but it's a very interesting aspect how rhythm plays into the ability to deal with trauma and to deal with obstacles in your life.
Yeah, and I'll take it a little step further. I had a conversation with my group. The group's been together for almost 50 years. Okay, we met at university and it's still going. But one thing that was really interesting that I brought up one day when it just was dawning on me, I said, I don't remember, because somebody had asked me the question, what do you do when you fall sick and you're on a major tour, 3-month tour, and you're all over the planet? And I tried to think, I thought about it. And then I brought it up to the group. I said, does anybody remember ever canceling a concert? And we used to do 150 concerts a year. Plus, I would be doing a regular TV show. I'd be doing all the studio work. I'd be all over the place. And I said, I personally don't remember ever in my life canceling a concert because I was sick. And I looked around and I said, do you guys, am I just... Did I just drown this information? He says, no, you're right. We've never. And we used to do some pretty grueling tours. But I do remember once I was very sick, so I would go to see the doctor while everybody was doing sound check and all of that. The doctor would give me something to take care of that or the pain. And then I would do the concert. And the minute the concert finished, they'd have to pick me up and take me back to the hotel. But it's very interesting, this whole thing, in that exactly to what you're saying, but on a larger scale. When and those of us who are involved in this professionally and doing it for so long, understand that when you're performing, you're in a complete other zone. And no matter what the rest of you does or what happens to it, you are still in this other place and you're performing, you're playing. You can sweat, unless you've lost a leg in the midst of this, you're still able to be in that place. And secondly, it's a really healing thing. I mean, it might sound funny to people, but when I think of it, is the most healing thing is performing, the music, any of that activity. And I say performing arts because dance is music, also the same thing. And I think it's a huge thing that's really not well understood because we spend so much time now on treating the result rather than going to the source and saying, well, why is this happening? And the source, we could be fixing it quite easily, but all the programs out of the music school, out of schools, period, kids not having in kindergarten, not creativity. And I was upset when my kids were growing up. I'd have arguments with school principals. I said, kids are not having any fun. We used to have fun and we did all right. I mean, we all have degrees, we're all doctorates, we have all of this. But there's something that we used to have that I don't see much. Kids are not having any fun. And part of that fun is in the activity, the cultural activities, or the performing arts activities, or the creative, call it by another name, something to be creative, to have that outlet, and be in that zone, that place that heals from the inside and from the outside. Never mind the society good that it does, and then the economic engine that it really represents, if you want to talk that language. So I agree, John, and that's interesting that you brought that, and it's true. The West is, we're dealing with ailments, and we let the pharmaceuticals solve it. I don't know. I have a different point of view, and I know that my personal experience, I have never canceled a concert in my entire life. And I think, let me ask you the question. Have you ever canceled because you were ill?
No, not that I can remember.
Yeah, you see what I mean? And I think if we ask anybody, unless they're on their deathbed, and people, I remember Buddy Rich saying, I'm going to die playing, or just, not too long ago, Some of people we know who are 99 years old and passing, and they're still playing. What is it? What is it? What is keeping that flame alive? That wellness, right?
Mhm.
And so I just think that we have music in our lives. Whether if I was an actor, it might be the acting. If I was a dancer, it might be dancing. But it's still that whole creative that changes everything. And it's not about counting, how much money is in the bank account. Those are tools. So, what we do, what we create. That's what we remember. How we feel, the result. Now that's important. I'm sounding like a preacher here, John, but you got me going. But I know you know exactly what I'm talking about, and those of us who are in this world totally understand. And there's no convincing. We don't. I mean, we're just talking to the choirs, preaching to the choir, right?
Mhm.
What are I know you have a lot of your own recordings, and you've done a lot of work in that world. Is there something that you haven't done that you would love to do, as you're shaping your journey moving forward?
Well, um, I'd like to have another 20 years. I'll have to go back in time just to have more time because I've always, intended to do more writing. And people have asked me for 40 years, when are you going to write a book? When are you going to write a book? And at one point I was saying, oh yeah, next year, next year, next year. I stopped saying that because it hasn't happened. Just because life, gets in the way, family stuff. At this point, I have two teenagers and I'm up to my eyebrows with just family, with family stuff. And I don't find the time to write. One of the regrets I have in my life is never having learned how to type.
Ah,
And for some reason, that it didn't they didn't offer it in school when I was coming up, and I wish I had learned how to type because now, after 70 years now, when I go to write something, it takes me 10 times longer than it would take for somebody who knows how to type. And over a 70-year period, that's probably 5 years of my life I spent just sitting there taking too long to type with two fingers to this day. And I even tried
yes.
to get a program and learn, but I'm too busy just making ends meet and projects and rehearsal and gig and the family and this and that. And so I never learned. And that's been kind of holding me back. I really would like to write. I've amassed an incredible resource collection of everything from vinyl. You see a little bit of it behind me.
Yes, I was going to
From
say.
vinyl to instruments and literature and stuff from all over Latin America and all over the Americas, all over. And I would love to write about my experiences, my perspective. Have more time to do that. I have
So,
my own record label that I started in 1984. So we're celebrating this year the 40th year of my label, Machete Records. And we have a new record that's going to be coming out at the beginning of the year. Pretty much the last 3 years, I've been putting out a record at the beginning every year. I put out a new recording because we're always writing, we're always recording, we're always collaborating with other musicians, and that's a legacy that I am proud of building that over the decades. And they're recordings that I'm proud of. I can look back and say, man, we have collaborated with a lot of elders who are now gone, and it was really wonderful to have documented
yes.
the work with them. So I hope to just continue doing that. I love composing and rehearsing and performing and recording, documenting. It's important to me to document the
Yes.
music and to document it with information because one thing I have not been able to do because of my heart is to release music digitally only. that really feels wrong to me because it goes into the ether and it's gone. There's no record of it. There's no album, no CD, nothing, no liner notes, no
Yes,
information
yes.
about the recordings, about the rhythms, about the history, about the collaboration. That's a very important way that I learned from the records. All those vinyl back there have liner notes, and it's very
Yes.
important information. It was a very important part of the inspiration and putting together the puzzle of the history of jazz and its relationship to Afro-Caribbean music. So I try to continue that by recording and putting out always extensive liner notes to whatever recordings that I'm putting out. The new one that I have coming out has, as always, a lot of guests. You know, we have at this point, the last 20 years, I've been playing with a quintet or a sextet, but there's always 25 or 30 musicians on the record because we're always collaborating. So we have Orestes Vilato, Elena Pinderhughes, Jerry Gonzalez, Jerry
Wow.
Medina, a few,
Yes, yes.
some wonderful practitioners of different generations who are going to be on the new album.
Nice. Well,
It's called
let me
Horizontes, by the way, dedicated to the children of the world. And it kind of leads me into something which I don't want to go too deep into it unless you want to, but there's also an elephant in the room for me, which is that a lot of folks don't want to talk about the political aspect of the music. And to me, it's perhaps the most important aspect, that our music is born from our political reality, from our social history and reality. So for folks
interesting.
who say, no, the music shouldn't be political, we get that a lot. People, oh, no, it should not be political. We're not bringing politics to the music. The music is born from those politics. Our history is documented in our own words through our music and our art and our lyrics and our poetry. And so the things it's inextricable. And that's very present, as people who know my work will see in all of the work, all of the notes. There's a very strong political awareness of basically defending human rights and trying to go against this right-wing swing, unfortunately, that we're witnessing in the world and in
Yeah.
this country, especially right now.
Yeah, and the world is kind of following some of it because it's that pendulum, sometimes everything goes this way until they get burnt and then we go this way and then finds it's like a cycle. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't think we can get away from it. My personal opinion of that is, we are who we are and we stand up for it at whatever cost. Sometimes being vocal about it and standing on the podium is sometimes may not be the right approach. There's a better approach, the longer approach by example. I think that has stronger and more long-term meaning than just saying things. Live by example and show it, and that says it all. But that's a personal opinion. Some people will get carried away with it, but is it right or wrong? I mean, that's a very personal thing. I think what's important is to always be who you are and always maintain. Like for example, in my world, it took me a long time to understand, and I would do it on purpose to bring women on board with things because I didn't honestly see the difference. There are people who are women performers who I thought were absolutely incredible, and I wouldn't use the word jealous, but I was in awe of how great they were. And then sometimes you wouldn't hear about certain people. So this whole macho thing always I had no place for it. I just didn't understand it. That this whole thing that we're making a big deal, which it is a big deal, but I could never understand why that was. Why would somebody have that weakness and have to be overpower other people or not give the place that a human decides and the human has talent is that person's decision to play. For example, there was a great timpanist in San Francisco for years ago. That I cannot remember her name now, but she's a phenomenal timpanist, and she was with the San Francisco Symphony for years.
Oh,
And
Elaine, is that Elaine?
I think that's the name. I don't know her,
Yeah.
but I was always in awe. And I'm saying, how come we only hear about one timpanist,
It
female?
was a black woman, right?
Exactly,
Yes,
yes.
yes. Hmm.
And to me, I said, is it? I mean, obviously she chose to be, and she was great. Gets the gig, gets the gig, and that's the way it should be. End of story. But then you see all this other stuff going on, which I thought was just complete hogwash. Not hogwash. I mean, it's complete misunderstanding of what life is, and disrespect for it. We're not living in the 15th century, and it's being so insecure. I mean, people with talent should be used, given their place, and it should be based on talent and the will to work, the will to put in the time for the common good, and then of course individually you will earn from that. I mean, I don't want to get political, of course, but I think I learned later that all this was going on, and I felt like so naive because I never understood that, and then I had to deal with that, and I'm saying, guys, this is. I remember going to a jazz camp, and one of those Jamie Aebersold camps. And this one girl, I would always pray she didn't show up, only because she was 10 times better than I was. I said, I won't play in the first band if she shows up. But she was amazing. And I used to tell her, man, I'm so happy you're there. But I said, now I have to play in the second band. But, it's by merit. And she was incredible. I'm just giving an example, but that's the way it is, So we either are of the level or not, and if you're not interested, you won't do it. And if somebody's that interested to put in all that work and has the talent and wants to do it, hey, makes the world a better place, that's for sure. And the more different approaches, the better. This homogeneous thing doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for anybody, and it makes it less interesting. Anyway. But I know what you're saying, and I think people who watch this, I think they can make up their own minds. But I agree with you, John, and I think those of us who are forward thinkers and don't live by those boxes have a lot better lives, and we leave better legacies, and then we feel good about it while we're doing it because we do what we can in a positive way. That's what I think. Anyway, but I'm going to throw a challenge at you, John, because you have done so much, and I had the same kind of not problem but issue that I had to deal with. I said I want to write my book of all those things, that path, that history, that all those things that need to be out there, even just for my kids if they're the only ones who read it. But I couldn't find a way to start it because I'm like you. I type like this, or actually sometimes like this. And I couldn't decide how I should do this. So I was never starting. So here, a friend of mine who's an ex-agent of ours said, Aldo, here's the way you do it. Because I know you, when you put your mind to something, you do it and you go all in. So it was my secret. I'm going to share it, but I'm going to challenge you with this. You should write that book. And the best way to do it, just a suggestion, is every morning, just 10 minutes. You sit at your computer, whatever comes out, you put it down. And just date it. Just add only 10, 15 minutes a day. Don't get ambitious. Don't think you're going to do 3 hours. No, just a little bit. So that happened maybe about a year ago for me, and I'm up to 220 pages. It's the only way I could have done it. And eventually it'll come out, and you should do it, John.
I've done that, and I have. It's not that I haven't started. I have a lot of stuff written, but it needs to be edited and organized and expanded, and it needs a lot. It still needs a lot more. I haven't been able to sustain that 10-minute thing over the decades, but I have started and stopped and started and written over strong periods of time for a while. And I have a lot of stuff already written. And I also have a lot of lectures that were recorded, that were transcribed for me by
Beautiful.
students. So I have a lot of material, but it just requires a lot of time to sit with it and sort it out. And
Yes.
the time is what I don't have.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. But if it's in one place, eventually you'll find it. If it's in one place, though, I think part of the secret is not to have it in too many different places, because then you have to remember where things are, and that's a challenge. But if everything is in one place, with the technologies we have now, it's a lot easier to sift through, and some of the young kids now are like work with lightning speed to put these things together. Just throwing that out there, John, because I think,
thank you.
you know, what you've been doing, and I follow what you're doing, and we hear things, and I watch things, and I say, that's beautiful. So continue and do it.
Yes, sir.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me in this conversation. And I always look forward to talking to interesting people and talking about their path and their journey, because hopefully others will get inspired by something in the conversation. At least it's documented and we've done it. Yes. So
Thank you, Aldo.
no, thank you, John. And as I always say, to be continued.